Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new episode of Rule of Albania. Today, with me is Fred Abrahams from Human Rights Watch. Fred has worked a lot on Albania, especially right after the fall of communism, right after 1991. He moved to Albania, he worked there, and ever since he held his ties to Albanians. Fred is also the author of Modern Albania, an amazing book. I've read it, I'm going to say it 4 times since it was published. I had to read it time after time just to remember some stuff that I needed to. Fred, welcome.
Albie, thanks, and I think you've read the book more than my mother, so congratulations.
I read it twice in the past, in the last 2 years, just because I needed it. I mean, it's a really good book. It has been cited a lot in Albania. Fred, let's jump back a little back in the time. How did you start the idea to write this book? What was the process of writing this book? How long it took? And what were the main obstacles to finish that book?
Well, Albie, first of all, thanks for having me, and thank you for having this podcast. You know, you open the door for conversations about Albania that are needed, and so thank you for taking the time to do that. Look, I mean, I first arrived in Tirana in the summer of 1993, and I think I understood I wanted to write something or be engaged and explain and present and describe this country from the beginning, because it was such a unique and powerful experience. Summer 93, that's 18 months after the Democratic Party took power. Right? I mean, the transition is still very much in motion. And I had a front row seat. Small town, small country. At that time, everything happened in the pyramid. All of the main conversations, the government, the opposition, the journalists, the intellectuals, the artists, everyone was in the pyramid at the time. And, I could sit there and be a part and observe history. So, I think I felt that was a huge, an opportunity for, a young man and also a responsibility. Because here I was witnessing this and mingling with, let's say, the political elite or the also cultural and elite of this country, and I felt like, hey, I have a chance to tell this story. And you know as well as anyone, there are not a lot of books about Albania. There are some of them are very good, but there's a real lack of, just not enough. There's just not enough. And if you compare to other countries in the region. So I felt like, listen, I have a unique perspective. I have access to the country. I learned the language to a degree. And so I have a chance here to help tell the world about this, and I jumped on it, and I'm so glad I did.
Yeah, I'm really happy you did write that book. I really appreciate it. Every Albanian, I guess, appreciates it because you give a kind of perspective that, to be honest, I never actually thought about. I didn't know many of the events that you describe in the book. I didn't even know they occurred. That they didn't even exist. So thank you so much for that. But during the process of writing this book, what surprised you the most?
Well, I got to say one thing, Albia, because you asked what were the obstacles.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, there were just two phases of this thing, right? There was the research and there was the writing. And the first was heaven and the second was hell. Okay. And for me, because the research was incredible. Okay, I'm a researcher. I could do that all day long, night and day, because what does it mean? Like, I got to interview the people who were playing in this drama, everyone from the Politburo members. I sat there with Ramiz Alia and Sophocles Lazari. I mean, who has a chance to sit down with these characters from history? Whatever you think of them, you're sitting there and asking them questions. I got to meet the student leaders of 1990. 91. I got to meet the founders of the Democratic Party and on and on and on. And so, like, talking with these people was a gift. It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure. And also because, a lot of these experiences I saw firsthand. So my main experience in Albania is 1993 to 97. Or maybe let's say 99 with the Kosovo War, 99, 2000. So then the book I started later, 2001, 2002, 2000s. So then I got to go back and ask people, hey, what were you thinking at that time, right? Here's what I saw. I witnessed 1997. I was in Tirana for parts of it. And now I could go back to those people, whether it was, against Polo in the Democratic Party or members of the Socialist Party who were also negotiating, thinking like Recep Meydani, for example, negotiating at that time, whoever it was, and the journalists and so on. Hey, what were you thinking? Why did you do this? What was the conversation in the meeting at that time? What was the international community saying, right? And that's an incredible opportunity. So that research and those interviews were fantastic, and not to mention the archives. So I submitted hundreds of freedom of information requests to the United States government, and I got a lot back from the State Department, even a few from the CIA, mostly older documents. So, going through all of that material, and also sitting in the National Library. The National Library in Tirana has every newspaper that's ever been published in the country, right? Going back, well, probably, way before 1990. And so, I sat there and read. They bring them up. There was this old elevator. It's like you write down what you want. I want Rolindia Democratica, December, January, 91. And then they
I must say that the National Library flooded, I think 2 years ago. So I hope that those things are still alive, because many of the books, at least I know that one of the compartments of the National Library was completely flooded, and books, really old books were, yeah. So I hope they're still alive.
I'm very sorry to hear that. Yeah, that would be a real tragedy. So, but all of that was a real pleasure, and going through that material. What was difficult is the writing, right? And I mean, because it's such a story. It's so complicated and long, and I didn't want to just tell a report. I'm good at writing human rights reports, but those are boring legalistic documents, factual, chronological. I wanted to tell a story. Because I wanted people to read this and be interested in it, and to make the characters come to life. And, these are fascinating characters. They have strong personalities. They have personal dramas. And so writing it in a way that had a narrative thread was hard. I'm not a writer. I'm not that's not my natural. And so that was the hard part and the main obstacle for me.
I understand. And shortly about the surprise, what surprised you the most during that process? Whether it was during the interviews, during the writing, were one of the people that you interviewed?
Yeah. So I guess one of the surprises, but maybe it's not such a surprise, because people they loved to talk. They loved it, right? I mean, maybe that's not a surprise. I mean, Albanians are, very communicative, and this was such a drama in their lives. And of course, people spoke from their own perspectives, right? So it's not that, you take and you believe everything that everyone said. My job was to document it and then to assess it, right? And that's the journalistic task, right? So you measure what they're saying and you compare it and you corroborate, So of course you have to understand, people have a spin, right? That's normal. And everyone wanted to be the front one, right? I was the first. I was the main one, and so on. But people were really willing to talk. And one thing that really fascinated me, maybe not a surprise, but it was interesting. It was so emotional. Do you know a number of people cried? A number of people cried while talking with me, because they were going through events in their lives that were so important, right? So crucial for the country, but also for them and their families, that they broke down. Remembering the intensity of that time. And, for me, that was an incredible experience, right? Because you realize how important it is, those changes and what it's meant for people, whether they stayed there, whether they've now emigrated, people lost their lives, and emerging from decades of this repression, coming out of prison, looking for lost relatives. I mean, that's all really deep and powerful emotions. So I found, maybe it wasn't surprised, but I really was impressed by that engagement.
Fred, as you said, Fred, I think you were in Albania in a period which was the most interesting to be in post-communism, 1993, 1997. Many things happened within that time frame, a lot of things. So I guess you got to know a lot of politicians back then. You got to understand Albanian politics really well. What do you think were the positive and negative aspects you found in Albanian politics / politician, in specific of any politician?
I mean, one thing that still is amazing to me, and I want to dig into it a little bit with you. It's amazing that the changes in Albania were not bloody, right? Because let's think back, at the amount of repression, the amount of violence, the total control of the party, right? And the fact this changed with really basically no violence. Violence came in 1997, but 1989, 90, 91, very little violence. There was some incidents, of course. And there was one moment when maybe the military soldiers were going to come out of the academy and they didn't, but I don't think that would have gotten much traction. So very little blood, right? The tipping the Hoxha monument in February of 1990, 91, right? No violence. So why? I mean, I think the answer to that is maybe not so positive, but it's worth thinking about. Look, and one of the main conclusions of my research in this was Albania did not have a revolution. Okay, there was no revolution in that country if we understand the meaning of the word to be, a radical break, right? Where you overthrow a power and a group of people and structures and you replace them with a new structure. That didn't happen in Albania, right? I mean, what happened in Albania was what someone called it once a reformation, meaning reform, like reform. It was managed. It was a managed process, a transfer of power. And that doesn't mean there weren't moments of bravery. There were definitely spontaneous, authentic moments where people stood up. The student movement is a good example of that. Really genuine moments where people challenged authority. There were those moments, but those were moments that jumped up, and then the party and the elites quickly got them under control. And so the process was managed. And I don't mean like a plan. I'm not suggesting there was a big plan. I don't think the Politburo sat down in 1980, 89 and said, Glasnost and Perestroika is coming, Berlin Wall has fallen, we better make a plan. I think they understood we have to change. I don't think they believed there was some, but they were very skillful. And because they had such control of the country, right? I mean, Ramiz Alia and the party, they had total control or very strong control of the country. They could manage it, right? And lack of dissidents, lack of opposition, everyone was dead or in prison or too scared. So I guess what I'm trying to say is in some ways this was very positive, right? Because obviously lives were saved. But on the other hand, Albania never had that break with its past. And the country is still experiencing the repercussions of that, right? That continues to this day. Right. For example, just one example is looking for the missing persons who went missing during communism, or dealing with the past, dealing with the crimes of the past. Still, the country has not really, in any serious way, dealt with the crimes of the past, and that's because it didn't break with that past. In fact, many of the people from that past are still there. Some of them have prominent positions in government or in parliament. Right. So it was a positive aspect and also a negative, right? It's one issue that had positive and negative aspects that have dominate the political culture and dynamics today.
You actually answered my next questions, which I was gonna ask. You said a transfer of power, and it struck me because I was thinking, was this transfer of power that happened back in 1990, is today the consequence of that transfer of power? Because as you said, we didn't break the ties with the past, with the communist past. And I think that transfer of power that was made back then have brought Albania to the day that we're in today. Like you said it, we have still strong ties with the communist past. We have today leaders state officials which are still in power. I'm not going to mention names, but as you said, in the parliament, in the government, everywhere. But yeah, it's really interesting.
And in the opposition.
I could say more in the opposition, actually. Sometimes.
Maybe.
Yep. That's what I've heard recently, at least. But yeah, this brings me to the next point. Like, so again, you've lived in Albania during a time which the country was led by Berisha, Sali Berisha, former president, former prime minister, which you have rightfully criticized in your book a lot, let's say, to a certain degree. And I think you got to know him firsthand back in the time, or met him in person. I'm not sure, but I remember from your book that the first moment that your relationship with him, or his relationship with you, was struck at the moment that he closed the university newspaper. That's how you describe it in the book. At least when I say he ordered someone to close it. Because as far as you write in the book, you started operating the newspaper, and all of a sudden they didn't want to let you write anymore. Please correct me if I'm wrong. So now, again, back at that time, you got to know also the current prime minister, Edi Rama, coming from a famous communist family, let's say. So as I was saying, you got to know also Edi Rama back at the time, coming from a prominent family with really strong communist ties. Back then, he was this, let's say, liberal guy, as you describe also in your book. He moved out of the country, then he came back in as a minister, so on and so forth. So we passed from Berisha to Edi Rama, who was a big critic of Berisha back at the time. And in your book, again, as I said earlier, you criticize Berisha a lot. And at the end of the book, you also talk a little about Rama, and you give some hints of, let's say, as of his autocratic tendencies, which still weren't very clear at the time. I tend to disagree a little at this point, just slightly, maybe because I've lived there and I've seen some other things that you haven't, maybe, I'm not sure. But back when you knew him, did you notice the slightest autocratic streak in him? So was there any autocratic tendency under the artsy look and the liberal painter of that time? Did you notice anything?
Well, first of all, I don't know Berisha, Sali Berisha, or Edi Rama personally. I don't know. I mean, I shook the hand of Sali Berisha once because I was by circumstance, but we never had a conversation. And unfortunately, he didn't agree to be interviewed for the book, because I would have gladly sat down and spoken with him. Of course, Edi Rama I have met, of course, but I don't know him well. No, I don't, because for a lot of the time when I was in Tirana, then he was in Paris. So I met him, of course, at that time. But I have never spent significant time with him. I mean, and I would say, in terms of the personality, I think there's a couple of things to say. I mean, the first is, does power change a person? And that's a question. And I would have to imagine that in some ways it does. That power does change a person. It would be very unique, and if it didn't. Also, because you can get surrounded by people who aren't willing to tell you the full truth, or aren't willing to express criticisms of you, or tell you they disagree with you. And so I think that could be. I'd be surprised if that wasn't the case. But at the same time, I think there probably were some consistencies, you know. I mean, I'm hesitating because I'm not a psychoanalyst, you know, I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist. But, you know, I think one thing that we can say for sure, I mean, Edi Rama always had, back at that time, I mean, right, at that time, he had a sharp disdain for, you know, for authority. He had, you know, a critical eye. He had, of course, this sort of, you know, keen artistic spirit, meaning to speak out, and you know, that kind of critical spirit and that disdain is, in an artist, it's attractive. In an artist, it's attractive. In a political leader, it's dangerous. Okay, you know, because, you know, it leads, and you can see it in the language, you know, in the language that he uses for the opposition, in the language he uses for the media, you know. And I have to say, actually, you know, yesterday, the day before we recorded this, you know, we said goodbye to President Trump, and some of the language that I see and hear Edi Rama using is just as nasty, if not worse, than the language that Trump has used to express his critics, to you know, to shame his critics. So, you know, that type of biting tongue, that type of sort of harsh and critical spirit, like I say, as an artist, it's welcome. But as a leader, I find it very very dangerous. And you know, we can see it now. You know, we can see the impact of that. And so, as a human rights activist, you know, which is my profession actually, it's difficult to swallow when I see the way that he has embraced Erdogan, though, including deportations of people to Turkey who we know are likely to face at least unfair trials, if not abuse in detention. We know this, right?
One of them that was deported last year, nobody knows about his fate. The one that was deported on January 1st, 2020. And it is said that he might be dead.
Interesting. Well, I mean, I can ask my colleagues who cover Turkey to look into that. It would be interesting to know where this person is. I don't know. But you know, but we do know what Erdogan's human rights record is like. And then there's the issues at home, which, you know, we can talk about. And I think, you know, you're following closely, from the media to influence of the judiciary and corruption. Right. So, you know, I think all of those, whether that's something, whether he's changed or whether those are consistent, you know, is a difficult thing. I mean, one thing I do want to say, though, that I think is important is that, I mean, let's remember the context as well. I just want to stress this a little bit, which is to say that, you know, I mean, Salih Berisha, in my view, he has still not been held accountable for what is probably the single most serious atrocity or abuse or disaster of post-communist Albania, and that's 1997. Right, you know, and let's not forget that 2,000 Albanians lost their lives. Right, dozens of people drowned in the Adriatic Sea when they tried to flee from Vlora to get to Italy. You know, and no one has really been held truly accountable for that. I mean, there were some arrests, but not the leader, head of state. Right, even though he was president, he was head of state at the time. You know, and you know, who really encouraged the pyramid schemes? Gerdets. Right. What about Gerdets? Okay. I mean, you know, I guess there have been cases against that, but, you know, he was head of state, and media as well. You know, I just want to hark back because this is the time that I remember when I was in Tirana, when we talk about the media. You know, a good friend of mine, Teodor Keiko, a wonderful Albanian writer, was brutally beaten outside of his apartment. I interviewed him days later. His head was smashed in with brass knuckles. You know, the office of Kohayon at that time, an important critical newspaper, Kohayon was burned, right? I remember interviewing, I think he was the editor at the time, Freddie Peza. I mean, he was the color of a patlajan. He was like, black and blue from head to toe. Eddie Rama was beaten. Eddie Rama was seriously beaten up, in those days. So I'm saying all of this. I am not comparing, and I'm also not belittling. I do not want to diminish the human rights violations we see today. That's not my point. I'm not saying those. I'm merely giving the context to say that the human rights violations have been a problem and they continue to be a problem in Albania.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything you said. But okay, those things happened back then. We know what Berisha did to the press, to the free voices of the civil society and everything. But let's remember that many of the people that are today in power, they were those people that were beaten back at the time or were muzzled by the government. We have Eddie Rama, you said it yourself. He was beaten up for speaking against the government. But look where we are today. A guy who fought for the freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and so on and so forth, is today doing, I'm not going to say much worse things, but he's right about there with Berisha when it comes to violations of human rights. I mean, I can count you tens of cases of beating journalists or attacking them or arresting them while reporting in protests. Even though they were released, that journalists shouldn't be arrested while they report. It creates a chilling effect. Maybe Rama is not going so far as beating or burning TV station, etc., but he's trying to create the chilling effect, which is quite. I can find the word. It's tough for the press in Albania when they see that how easily a journalist is muzzled, when they see how easily a TV station is closed, and then years later we lose the arbitration award, and now we have to pay a foreign businessman because we closed his media. I'm talking about the 2015 case against Becchetti, the Italian investor in Albania. We have to pay him right now at least 100 million euros, and it can become 300 million in a few months, maybe, we don't know. Adi Krasta worked there. He was fired from there because they closed the station. Adi Krasta worked at Top Channel at News 24. He was fired from both those stations because he was speaking critically against the government. And now finally he has found a place where he can freely speak. And he spoke with you. I mean, Rama is doing this constantly. I mean, look at how he has handled the COVID situation. I mean, I understand it's a pandemic. We have to be careful. But if you look throughout the world, nobody is doing what Rama, at least nobody in the democratic world is doing what Rama is doing in Albania. I mean, he is doing all these political rallies, but on the other side, people are not allowed to protest. Where's the difference? Where's the difference between a huge crowd of a political rally than a protest in the boulevard in front of the Prime Minister's office? So I guess you get my point. Yep.
Oh yes, no, I do very much, and that's why I'm trying to bring the book up to date because I want to report and document on the last, or where I left off, basically. I mean, I would say if I had to describe the differences, I would say the Berisha era abuses were blue collar, and the Rama era abuses are white collar, right? Because Berisha's behavior, and it was a different time, right? It was a different era where they were more brazen and blatant, right? You just, you beat someone and it's out there, and you burn down a newspaper. The tactics today are much more sophisticated, and therefore one could argue they're more dangerous, right? Because today, yes, there's violence at police abuse, there's police abuse, and I know journalists are arrested or even beaten up when they're doing their jobs, but you don't have, at so much the political violence where someone's waiting outside your back door. But what they do is they buy you, right? You're bought, and it's much, cleaner in the sense that it's harder to trace, but it has the same effect. Right. And I think if we're looking at media freedom today, I know we have to look at the package that has been, I guess, withdrawn after criticism from Venice Commission and others. Maybe it will come again. We don't know, but but if you really want to look at media freedom, I think you have to look at media ownership, right? Who is owning the main media outlets, especially the television stations? What are their interests? Who are they connected to politically and financially? And how does that affect what stories are told and what stories are not told? Right, and in that sense, I would venture to say that Albania's level of media freedom is disturbingly low, especially given that we're now so many years past the so-called non-existing revolution, and that's why I think I said this to Adi Krasta, and I think it's true. If you stop and say today, is Albania more democratic today than it was in 2013? I'm not sure that you can say yes. I mean, it's hard to measure exactly. Give it a grade. But with media freedom, these trends are really, really troubling. And we can look at other areas today. The judicial reform it's a very complex subject, and I'm still learning, getting up to speed, about it. There have been some, I think, changes that could lead to have a lasting impact. But do the courts truly function today as they should? Can you get a fair hearing if you have a dispute in Albania? Well, I don't believe that on the whole you can, or not enough as is needed for that society. Money will still buy you out of a serious crime, right? And so that's another area where the judiciary has not achieved the independence that the country needs, that the people deserve, right? That the people deserve, and that any sort of stable functioning society must have in order to function. So, I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm trying to lean away from the comparisons, because it was a different time. But if we just look today, I'm not going to disagree with you, Albi. I mean, the concerns are there. And by the way, 8 years in power is a long time, right? That's a long time. It's a chance to really accumulate power. It feeds into Albania's unfortunate political legacy of strong paternalistic lead, right? Which is where, in my view, the health of the nation would benefit, if we're talking about a pandemic, from moving in the other direction, meaning more pluralistic leadership.
Right. Going back to the way this government has bought the media, I mean, you can see it from the fact that, for instance, like a month ago, there were massive protests in Albania. If you heard about, like, the police killed a 26-year-old guy doing nothing at all in the street. There were these massive protests, and you can tell because none of the big medias, and when I say big medias, I guess you know who I'm talking about, the big names of the media in Albania, none of them were broadcasting the protests, first of all. And what they were doing is that they were not saying that the police, let's say, is beating the people up and everything. They're just being like, look how the protesters burned down the tree that the municipality put in the main square, or look at how the protesters broke this trash bin, and so on and so forth. They were trying to portray the protesters as the ones that were on the wrong side and the police on the right side. If you understand what I want to say, like, the media was trying to, like, support the government in that case and hide, I mean, those big medias. And with regard to the judiciary, you're saying that you're talking about the impartiality, neutrality and stuff. And I say that we're still not there because, first of all, we don't have a judiciary right now. Sorry to say it. We don't have a high court. We finally have a constitutional court now, but still it's not full. We have only 7 members. And I like to think that we have a constitutional court. At the moment we have 9 members, because again, with 7 members, things can happen or things can't happen. We don't have a Supreme Court, and then the Court of Appeals is dying. So there's a lot of vacuums in the judiciary for now. But yeah, I completely agree with what you said. But with regard, you said that 8 years for Rama is a pretty long time in power. I like to say that Rama was not in power for only for 8 years. People tend to think that Rama has been here only from 2013. Let's not forget, he was the mayor of the biggest city in Albania for 11 years. He had the ties with these big businessmen and cronies long before he came to power as prime minister. That's how I like to think. Everything started when Rama became mayor. And let's not forget, he was minister from 1997 to 2000, and then he became mayor for 11 years, and then prime minister. So I tend to think that Rama has been in power for at least 24 years. That's how I like to think it, because he built up everything based on the fact that he was a mayor. He got to know the big guys that rule Albania today. But yeah, with regard to the rest, I completely agree with you. But today we are.
I think.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think one other element, and a very important one here, is the international community, because we know that I mean Europe in particular, the United States, and obviously Turkey, and to an extent even countries from the Middle East and Arab states, they play a role, right? I mean, Albania is a small country, right? And so that they play an important role. And I think there is something that's a little bit consistent if we look through this entire period, right? Which is that for the most part, the overriding policy objective of, let's say, Western democracies, the overriding policy has been stability, meaning that Albania should remain calm, right? That's not the only policy, I mean, there's economic interests, especially for, Greece and Italy, and there's, and I do believe generally, these countries wanted Albania's democratization as well. They weren't against the democratization, but the overriding policy was stability. It was particularly intense during the Yugoslav wars because of the fear of the conflict spreading, first to Kosovo, Macedonia, which it did in both places anyway, but Albania getting involved in the larger Albanian project. And it continues to this day, right? And so what I'm trying to say is, what happens internally in Albania, freedom of the press, judicial reform, and it's secondary. And that may come as a shock, because I know the EU has invested millions and millions of euros in the judicial reform. So I don't want to suggest that it's not, high on the policy list. It is, I mean, and but the overriding factor is, do we have a leader in Albania who will pick up the phone, with whom we can deal with whom we can negotiate, and whom we can make sure that Albania, stays safe, stable. And unfortunately, I mean, I think that's a short-sighted approach. Like, listen, I'm a human rights realist. I really am. I am not an absolutist. I'm very realistic, and I appreciate that the stability is important. It's a worthwhile goal. I understand why Washington and Brussels and Berlin pursue it. I just think they could have done more, and they still today could do more to have both, right? Because the leverage of the West is very, very strong. It's very strong, and they could encourage the stability and push Albania to be more democratic, to respect separation of powers, to be more, pushing the government, whoever is in power, to respect its international obligations. And they have not always been willing to step up and take that stance. And I think today is a little, there are voices, of course, there are critical voices, but I think it could be stronger. It could be stronger. And then I just want to, I'm rambling a little bit, but just bear with me for a second. There was another interesting angle here that's worth thinking about, which is, in fact, Edi Rama now is trying to play outside his borders. He is trying to play. He's been very engaged, not just in relations with Vučić in Serbia, which of course is a good thing, having him come to Tirana, going to Belgrade. I mean, I can't critique that. On the contrary, but getting involved in Kosovo, trying to push deals around Kosovo, trying to push controversial deals around Kosovo, and and also, really, I would say waving a nationalist flag. Now, I think a lot of this is electioneering, right? The elections are coming in June, and a lot of those positions that he's taken, including his really knee-jerk and over-the-top critique of the Kosovo Special Court, that's about elections, a lot of it. But it's also quite surprising because it's the area where the West is most concerned. Like, that's the red line, but that's the line in the sand, right? And, in Berisha's years, when he started to meddle too much outside of his borders, Macedonia or Kosovo, that's when Western governments came and really wagged their finger. And it's interesting to me that so far, maybe they're doing it behind the scenes, or maybe they just realize this is just elections, it's not serious. But he hasn't had a real strong pushback from that, although it's clearly across the line that Western governments have always drawn with regard to their approach and policy to their Albanian politics.
Yeah, I don't know if you heard recently, but a few days ago, Rama started to blame specific countries in the EU for not helping Albania with the COVID vaccines. I don't know if you heard about that. He was rambling on these EU countries that we were left on the side, like the EU owed us the vaccines. And there were a lot of responses from EU embassy countries in Albania, and Rama still kept pushing. He received a letter from the French embassy saying that France and the EU have always been friends of Albania. They are the main investor and everything. And Rama still went on like trying to blame the EU. I don't know if he's doing this for just the elections, or he's gone mad. I don't know. He's going full autocrat, or I don't know how to explain this. Like, I don't know how you see it, because I mean, meddling with Erdogan, like crossing Europe many times now for a lot of things. Do you think he's becoming the true autocrat now?
I mean, look, first of all, I don't know why he criticized EU for the vaccine, but I will say there are reasons to criticize the EU, right? I mean, the EU's approach to the accession process and its handling of Albania has been, has many points where it can be legitimately criticized. And I can understand and appreciate the frustration that Albanians, if it's him, the government, or others, have with this process. And let's not forget, by the way, like, has Albania met all of the conditions to like join tomorrow? No, it hasn't. But a lot of the slow process has nothing to do with Albania, right? Like, right now, the next step in the process, as I understand, is the intergovernmental conference, the first one. But Albania is linked to Macedonia, Northern Macedonia, and there's a dispute with Bulgaria. So it's out of Albania's hands, right? And of course, the EU is deeply divided. So the process has stalled many times, not because of anything to do with Albania itself, its reform or lack of reform. So, I mean, I can understand the appreciation, and I actually think I can also understand then why Rama in particular has turned to Turkey, because if the EU is not going to move quickly, he can look in the other direction. The criticism is why he has to embrace Erdogan in such an extreme way, and which is shameful, because you can still approach the country and keep your dignity. So he's gone too far. But I can understand, why he would do that. And then in this case, it probably is electioneering, I would imagine, right? I mean, everything we're going to see over the next 4 months, we should view through the prism of the elections. If it's building a hospital in fear, or criticizing the EU for the vaccine, I would imagine, that's what it's about. I'm not justifying it. I'm just explaining it, or trying to explain it.
Speaking about elections, Albanians are in front of all Albanians right now. It's a really tough choice. Do we continue with the status quo? Do we keep Rama, which I think we shouldn't? That's my opinion. Or should we make a rotation? Like, we need to change the government or not? And Rama has been inciting this idea that if the opposition comes to power, that's the end of Albania. It's pretty much what Trump was trying to say here in the United States. Like, if the Democrats come to power, socialism will come to America, blah, blah, blah. That's what Rama is trying to say, that if the Democrats came, he's like, they had the chance, they destroyed Albania, they burned Albania. If they come again, they will do the same. So that's his language. And if he wins, he would be the first prime minister to hold power for 3 mandates, if he does hold a third mandate, and if he wins it, to hold power for so long after the fall of communism. No one ever did it before. Berisha was in power, but he never was more than 2 mandates, for example. Do you think this will damage the Albanian democracy, if we have a democracy? I don't think we have a democracy. We are an illiberal democracy. I think so. Should first of all, will Albanian democracy be diminished more, or do you think should we choose the lesser evil, in this case, which is the opposition, which many think it's the old Democratic Party? I tend to think a little different, because many of the old figures in the Democratic Party are not there anymore. If they are behind the scenes, I can't tell. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. But how do you see this?
So, I mean, I would never tell anyone how to vote, anywhere.
Yeah, sure.
That's a personal choice. I mean, I would say, just coming, I'll come at it this way, if you'll allow me, which is jumping off from the Western, the Western policy towards Albania. I think Edi Rama had immense support. He had a very deep and wide reservoir of support in 2013 because of distrust and dislike for the opposition, right? So, the US government and European governments, they were really tired with the previous government. They felt that Edi Rama offered a new hope and a new direction. And so they were willing to tolerate a lot. And I think that maybe that helps to explain why their critiques and their criticisms have been tempered over the past 8 years, because there's a generally low level of trust for those oppositions. That may be changing, and as you say, that maybe the character of the opposition is changing. That being said, I am worried about the accumulation of power in Albania. I am. I think that is the political legacy of the country. It's the tradition is to have strong leaders on horses, and it's hard to get them off the horse. And that's not healthy. It's not healthy. No one person has all the answers. No one person can paint the town. No one person can decide what's right and what's wrong for a nation. And so opening the door and allowing the plurality of voices is healthy. Not all of those voices will be beautiful, that not everyone sings well. But they must be allowed to sing, and the concentration holding the microphone for a very long time can lead to the dominance of one voice. Now, I do think ultimately, the deeper issue is what others have called the oligarchs, right? Because the deep reach of powerful financial interests, because Edi Rama could leave office, right? But the system that deep connection of powerful business interests that dominate the social good, that influence policy, that affect how people get their health care and their infrastructure and their education, because decisions are made based on the interests of powerful few. That can remain. That can remain. And in fact, the people who come to power after Rama, if that happens, they'll inherit that system and they will probably use it, right? So for me, in the long term, that's the structural change that's more important. getting past individuals, right? This shouldn't be about individuals. This should be about systems, and finding ways that people serve for the public interest. We've always said, goes back to, repeated it too many times, but it's a good line, is that, we want leaders who see their positions as a responsibility instead of an opportunity, right? People who will rule, who will govern instead of rule, right? And who will allow for policy debates and decisions that are in the public interest instead of the personal pocket. And that's the challenge. That's deeper. That goes beyond any of the individuals today, and is would be maybe the real revolution.
I completely agree with all your points, Fred. And to close this podcast, you're going to come up with a second part of modern Albania, which I like to call it personally, as I'm going to also call this podcast post-modern Albania. Like, let's say post 2013 Albania. What will you do different in the process of making this second part of the book, let's say, or this group of papers of these articles that will comprise the second part of the book? What will you do differently from the first one?
I'm still trying to figure it out, honestly. So I don't have a set answer for you. I mean, one thing that's difficult is obviously I'm not in Albania, right? So the chance to sit down and have coffee with people is just so essential, and doing it over the phone is terrible, right? Or it's just you lose the human. So that's one thing. That's one thing. I mean, the other is, I mean, this is probably boring, so I'll just make it short. But is the format? That's what I was telling you about writing a book, is you have to think about the format. It's not just the information, right? And so if it's going to be an article, well, I can't assume that people will have read the book, right? And so I have to tell a story that will stand on its own,
yeah.
Right? And if I were just adding a chapter to the book, and I knew you would be reading it 1 through 10, well, then I could build on the characters. I don't have to reintroduce who are these people, right? So, I mean, this is just a literary technicality, but it's relevant. So, so I'm thinking about that. But right now, I'm just trying to get back up to speed, get a feel for it, get a flavor for it. And I guess, honestly, I don't think I'm going to go into great details, because it's maybe a few cases that are descriptive to give an example. But I'm more interested in the trends. What we talked about, how do you really democratize? What is the interplay with nationalism and that democratization? How does Albania look at its past? I may use that as a window. Very, very fascinated at how Albania has come to terms with the atrocities of the communist era, and what that says about the society today. Right. So those are some of the themes, I guess. Maybe I may use that as a way to tell the story, but still playing with it.
Well, me personally, I can't wait. I can't wait for you to publish, let's say, this book that will stand alone. But still, I think it will be connected to the first book, of course. Fred, thank you so much for being on Rule of Law Albania with me today.
Albie, it's a pleasure, and congratulations on the podcast. Please keep it up.
And to everyone that will listen to us, I will include in the description of this podcast, both on Spotify and other platforms, also YouTube, the website link of Modern Albania. You can find many interesting things there. I urge you to read the first book so that you are ready for the second part when it comes up. Fred?
Not to me, Albie.